His wife poured wine on him at the dinner table. Not by accident, not in anger. Slowly, deliberately. In front of 30 people she had spent years performing for, while he sat there and let it happen, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, without saying a single word. The room laughed, her brother laughed the loudest, and she smiled the way people smile when they are absolutely certain they are the most powerful person in the room. She was not. What she did not know, what none of those 30 people knew, was that the quiet man she had just humiliated in front of her entire professional world had signed a $40 billion contract 3 hours before she picked up that glass. What she did not know was that the platform she had presented to her own boardroom as a model of excellence, the case study on slide 14 of her pitch deck, had been built in the back office she told him to be ashamed of. And what she did not know was that the moment her phone lit up at that dinner table, her career, her brother's career, and everything she had spent 9 years building her identity on would begin to collapse. One domino at a time. Here is the question. When a man spends 9 years being invisible in his own marriage, what happens when the world finally sees him? If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And if this one already has you locked in, drop a like right now. It helps more than you know. Tell me where you are watching from today. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. Then let me take you all the way back to the night it happened. The dinner, the wine, the silence, and show you exactly what was sitting in that back office while his wife was taking her bow. The dining room had been transformed. Simone had hired a catering company out of Silver Spring, the kind with white-gloved servers and printed menus tucked into ivory envelopes. The furniture had been rearranged. The good china was out. 30 people filled the space between the foyer and the back hallway, and every single one of them had been chosen deliberately. Partners from Meridian Financial Group, 2 women from Simone's graduate school cohort, a city councilman she had been cultivating for 18 months, and a cluster of social friends whose primary function in her life was to witness her ascent and confirm it back to her. Calvin stood near the kitchen doorway in a charcoal dress shirt he had ironed himself that morning. He was not uncomfortable exactly. He had learned, somewhere around year 3, that discomfort required expectation. He had stopped expecting much from these rooms. He held his glass loosely and watched the caterers move between guests like they had done this 100 times, because they had. He had eaten a plate of food, standing up in the kitchen at 6:30 before the guests arrived, the way he always did at her events, because the conversations tended to start early, and he tended to get forgotten in them. That part did not bother him the way it once had. The room smelled like gardenias and someone's expensive perfume, and the short ribs the catering team had been slow cooking since noon. A jazz quartet Simone had hired from the university played softly near the bay window. It was a beautiful evening. Calvin acknowledged that without irony. Simone tapped her glass at 8:47. The room gathered around her the way rooms always did. She had a gift for that, for making the air change when she was ready to speak. She stood at the head of the dining table in a deep burgundy dress that she had bought specifically for tonight, and she began her remarks with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed them in the bathroom mirror that morning. She thanked Gerald Ashford, who was not present, but who had sent a congratulatory floral arrangement that occupied an embarrassing amount of counter space. She thanked her team at Meridian. She thanked the councilman by name, which made him straighten slightly with pleasure. She thanked her brother Quinton, who was leaning against the far wall with a glass of bourbon and a grin that had not changed since childhood. She did not mention Calvin. not an omission born of oversight. The pause where his name might have lived came and went, and Simone moved through it without breaking stride, the way you step over a crack in the sidewalk without looking down. Calvin watched her from his position near the kitchen. He noticed? He always noticed. He also noticed that 3 people near the front of the room glanced briefly in his direction when the pause arrived, a flicker of social awareness quickly suppressed. He raised his glass anyway. It was a small gesture. He lifted it in her direction from across the room, a quiet, private toast, the kind a husband offers a wife because that is what husbands do. Several people saw him do it. The room registered the gesture in the particular way rooms register things they are not sure how to categorize. Simone looked at him, and then she reached for her own glass, a tall pour of Chardonnay, almost full, and she crossed the 3 steps between them with the smile of a woman who had decided something. She held the glass over his lap. She tilted it, slowly, deliberately. The wine moved like a sentence being completed, cold against the fabric of his slacks, spreading in a wide stain across his thighs, while the room went the specific kind of quiet that happens when something crosses a line. Most people did not realize existed until it was crossed. "Sit down, Calvin," she said, her voice warm with performance. "Tonight's not about errands and email." Quinton laughed first. It was the full laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a man who had been waiting for permission to release it. 2 or 3 others followed, uncomfortable sounds dressed up as amusement, the social reflex of people who had decided in that instant that laughter was safer than silence. Calvin set his glass on the table. He looked down at the stain spreading across his lap with the same expression he used to review quarterly reports. Present, measured, processing. He set his napkin beside the glass without using it. He nodded once. He turned toward the hallway. He was almost at the doorway when Simone's phone lit up on the table behind him. He did not turn around to see it. He did not need to. He heard the room's quality of sound shift again, heard Simone pick it up, heard the brief silence that followed. He knew the text had arrived. He had expected it, more or less, since 4 o'clock that afternoon, when the wire confirmation came through, and he understood that news of that size would move through certain circles before morning. He paused in the doorway, not because he was waiting. He was simply present in the moment the way he had always been present, fully, quietly, without announcement. Behind him the room was absolutely still. He heard Simone's breath change. He did not turn around. He did not need to see her face to know what was on the screen. He had signed the papers 3 hours ago in the back office at his desk with a pen his grandmother had given him when he graduated college, a desk no one in that room had ever been invited to see. The FedEx envelope was still there, sitting in the center of the blotter, the signature page face up under the lamp. He walked inside. The silence behind him was not new. It had been 9 years in the making. To understand why Calvin Merritt never defended himself, you have to understand where he came from. He was not a man built for performance. He was built for work, the quiet, unglamorous, early morning kind that nobody applauds because nobody sees it. He grew up in a house where his grandmother rose before sunrise to press her uniform, where his father kept a ledger by hand because he did not trust banks with his arithmetic, where the lesson was never spoken aloud but lived in every room. What you build in private is yours forever. What you perform in public belongs to whoever is watching. He met Simone Elaine Ashford Briggs at a conference in Atlanta in the spring of 2014. She was presenting on fintech compliance frameworks. He was in the back row, quiet, taking notes on a legal pad, in the handwriting his third-grade teacher had called too small to read. She was extraordinary at the front of a room. He noticed that first, not her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the specific intelligence of how she moved through an argument, how she anticipated the next question before it was asked. He introduced himself afterward. She was surprised he had anything interesting to say. That surprise, he would later understand, never fully left her. They dated for 14 months. She found his quietness appealing at first, the way people find unfamiliar things appealing before they decide those things are problems. He was steady where she was electric. He listened where other men talked over her. He did not need to be the most interesting person in the room, which she interpreted as modesty, and which was actually something else entirely, a man who simply had no use for rooms. They married in November of 2015 at Greater Bethel AME Church on a Saturday morning, with the light coming through the stained glass the color of amber. 83 guests. Simone's side filled 2/3 of the pews. Calvin's family occupied the rest, his aunt Celestine, his cousin Marcus, 3 men from his father's old neighborhood who drove 4 hours because that was what you did. C. Merritt Holdings had been incorporated 8 months prior. Calvin had said nothing about it, not because he was hiding it, but because he had learned in those 14 months of courtship that Simone's interest in his work was thin in the way that politeness is thin. She asked questions that did not require answers. She changed subjects with the efficiency of someone managing a meeting. He had simply stopped offering information that would not be received. The back office in their house, a spare room off the hallway that Simone had initially imagined as a reading room or a home gym, became his without ceremony. He set up his desk. He closed the door. He went to work. She never asked what the work was. In year 2, Viridian Logic had 11 clients and revenues of just over $4 million. Calvin sat at his desk while Simone attended galas and industry dinners and came home to describe the people she had met with the enthusiasm of a woman cataloguing treasure. She mentioned a few times in the early years that she wished he would come with her. Then she stopped mentioning it. The narrative she settled into was easier. Her husband was a freelancer of some kind, a tech consultant, vague work that paid vague money, nothing to anchor a conversation to at a cocktail party. Quinton arrived into the marriage the way he arrived into every room, loudly and without invitation. He was Simone's younger brother by 3 years, a man whose entire personality had been assembled from the outside in. The right watch, the right schools, the right name drops delivered at the right volume. He worked in compliance, which he described at every opportunity as if it were something more glamorous than it was. He had a way of laughing at Calvin that was technically deniable, a half-second too long on a pause, a look exchanged with Simone that lasted just past comfortable. At the family's 4th of July gathering in year 3, with Simone's aunts arranged on lawn chairs and the grill smoking, and the cousins chasing each other through the sprinkler, Quinton had referred to Calvin as Simone's house husband in a voice pitched precisely loud enough to carry. Nobody corrected him. Calvin got himself another plate of food and sat back down. By year 4, Viridian Logic had grown past anything that could be described as a consulting practice. Revenue had crossed $340 million. Calvin had hired a chief operating officer, a general counsel, and an engineering team of 47 people distributed across 6 time zones, all of whom communicated with their founder through encrypted channels that Simone would not have known to look for, even if she had been curious, which she was not. The FedEx envelopes began arriving regularly that year. Contracts, incorporation documents, executed agreements on behalf of C. Merritt Holdings, the parent structure that held everything. They came to the house addressed to him. He collected them from the porch, brought them inside, and set them on the desk in the back office. Simone passed that hallway every single day for 9 years. She never once asked what was in those envelopes, not once, not out of distraction, not out of busyness, not out of any collision of priorities, out of a settled, unexamined certainty that whatever was in them could not possibly be worth her attention. That certainty was the most expensive assumption she ever made. Her contempt was built on a question she never bothered to ask. Simone brought Calvin to exactly 3 Meridian events. The first was a cocktail reception at a hotel downtown in the spring of year 2. Marble floors, past appetizers, the kind of lighting designed to make everyone look more successful than they were. Calvin wore the navy suit he kept pressed in the back of the closet, and he stood beside Simone for 40 minutes while she worked the room with the precision of someone running a campaign. He did not mind the standing. He was good at it. What he noticed was the moment a senior director named Wallace leaned towards Simone and asked, with genuine curiosity, what her husband did for a living. Simone hesitated for exactly 1 beat too long. Then she said, "Tech consulting," and steered the conversation somewhere else. Calvin said nothing. The second event was a firm dinner in year 3, and the third was a holiday gathering that same December. At the holiday party, a woman named Renata, sharp-eyed, direct, the kind of person who asked real questions and waited for real answers, pressed Calvin pleasantly on the specifics of his work. He had started to answer when Simone materialized at his elbow, laughed lightly, and said, "He keeps his trade secrets very close to the vest." Renata smiled. Calvin smiled. The conversation moved on. On the drive home, Simone told him it was probably easier if he skipped the work events going forward. She said it the way you say a thing you have already decided. He agreed the way he agreed to most things she had decided, quietly, without argument, making a small internal notation and moving on. He was not invited to any Meridian events after that. In year 5, something happened that Calvin would have found extraordinary if he had been paying attention to it from the outside. Simone stood in front of Meridian's board of directors in a 43rd floor conference room with a floor-to-ceiling view of the city and presented a case study she had assembled on a sovereign cloud infrastructure firm whose operational efficiency had reduced Meridian's data processing costs by 22% over 36 months. She had titled slide 14 of her deck, "The Standard Bearer." She spoke about the firm's architecture with the fluency of someone who had studied it closely. She praised its engineering culture, its documentation discipline, its almost unusual commitment to building systems that did not fail under pressure. The firm was Viridian Logic. She did not know that. The case study had come through Meridian's vendor analysis team, fully anonymized, flagged as confidential per the service agreement. She had never seen the underlying contract. She had never had any reason to look for one. She delivered that presentation with the confidence of a woman holding evidence of the industry's best practices, and when the board nodded in approval, she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has correctly identified excellence. Her husband had built that excellence in the room at the end of their hallway. It was around this time that Gerald Ashford, Meridian's chief strategy officer, a man who had spent 30 years chasing the next institutional advantage, became publicly frustrated in meetings about Viridian Logic's anonymity. He told Simone directly at a strategy lunch in year 6 that he had been trying to identify the firm's founder for 2 years. He said the company ran its affairs with a level of structural privacy that was, in his experience, either the sign of a criminal enterprise or the sign of someone who did not need anything from anybody. He was fairly certain it was the latter. He wanted an introduction. He asked Simone if she had any connections in that part of the infrastructure market. Simone laughed and said she wished she did. Quinton Deshawn Briggs joined Hartwell and Briggs in Year 4, which was the same year Simone used her professional network to make 3 phone calls on his behalf. She did not do this because she thought Quinton had earned it. She did it because he was her brother, and because a brother in a respectable position was another data point in the story she told about her family's standing. Quinton was grateful in the way that people are grateful when they receive something they believe they deserved anyway. He settled into his compliance role and found fairly quickly that the gap between what the regulations required and what the paperwork showed was a gap that could be managed. He routed 2 transactions through Hartwell and Briggs in Year 6 that should have triggered an automatic disclosure flag under Meridian's derivative processing agreement. He buried those flags with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the paperwork would never be examined closely enough to matter. He was not wrong for a while. Calvin's compliance team at Veridian flagged the irregularity in Year 7, a data certification discrepancy in Meridian's infrastructure, reporting that did not align with the actual performance metrics Veridian's systems were generating. Calvin reviewed the flag himself. He pulled the underlying documentation. He saw Simone's signature on the certification. He sat with that for a long time. Then he created a folder, labeled it with a date and a case number, and filed it in the server architecture his general counsel had established for exactly these kinds of situations. He documented everything. He did not act on any of it. He went to church that Sunday, as he did most Sundays, and sat in his usual pew 3 rows from the front while the choir opened with something that moved through the room like warm air. Deacon Raymond Fields noticed him there, as he always did, this quiet man who came alone and left alone and never asked for anything from the congregation except the service itself. Raymond had never asked Calvin about his marriage. He was old enough to know that a man who comes to church without his wife on a regular basis is either building something or surviving something, and either way, the pew was available. The folder sat in Calvin's server. The gap in Meridian's compliance record sat inside the folder like a quiet clock, its hands moving, its alarm not yet set. He never planned to use it until the wine made the decision for him. Calvin spent the weekend doing exactly what he always did. He woke at 5:30 on Saturday. He made a pot of coffee, dark roast, same brand his father had kept in the cabinet above the stove, and he took his cup to the back office and sat at his desk while the neighborhood was still quiet. He answered 14 emails. He reviewed the final executed pages of the Ether contract, which Patricia's office had digitally archived the night before. He ate a bowl of oatmeal standing at the kitchen counter at 7:15 and was back at his desk by 7:30. Simone did not emerge from the bedroom until 11. When she did, she moved through the house like a woman walking through a room she no longer recognized. She had spent Friday night and all of Saturday in a state that Calvin could only describe, from the brief sounds that traveled through the walls, as controlled unraveling. She had made phone calls. She had paced. At one point he heard her on the phone with Quinton, her voice low and sharp and searching for something solid to hold on to. She did not knock on the back office door. He did not invite her to. He called Patricia Okafor on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. He did not need to explain much. Patricia had represented C-Merit Holdings since the day of its incorporation in March of 2015. She had drafted the operating agreement, structured the subsidiary entities, and designed the privacy architecture that had kept Veridian Logic's ownership invisible through 11 years of industry activity. She knew the full shape of what Calvin had built in the way that architects know buildings. Not just the surface, but the load-bearing walls. When he told her what had happened at the dinner, she listened without interruption. When he finished, she said simply, "Come in this morning." He was at Okafor and Reeves by 9:45. Patricia's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had the quiet authority of a place where serious decisions were made and then never discussed in public. She was already standing when her assistant showed Calvin in, a compact woman in her early 50s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes she did not need yet. She gestured to the chair across from her desk and sat down at the same time he did, and she opened the C. Merritt Holdings master file without ceremony. She walked him through the structure from the top. C. Merritt Holdings, she confirmed, had been incorporated in Delaware on March 4, 2015, a full 8 months before Calvin and Simone were married. It was a single-member limited liability company with Calvin as its sole member and manager. It had never been disclosed to Simone, which was not illegal. There was no legal obligation in their jurisdiction to disclose pre-marital business holdings to a spouse, provided those holdings were properly maintained as separate property and no marital funds were commingled with the entity's assets. Calvin had been meticulous on this point. Not $1 of Simone's income had ever touched a C. Merritt account. The entity was hermetically sealed from the marriage. Simone had zero legal claim on any of it. Patricia then laid out the current asset picture with the precision of someone reading coordinates. Viridian Logic, as of the Ether contract execution, carried an enterprise valuation of $4.3 billion. The Ether contract itself represented $42 billion in committed revenue over 7 years. A figure that would, Patricia said, make Viridian Logic one of the largest privately held infrastructure firms in the country. C. Merritt Holdings, as the 100% parent entity, owned all of it, every share, every dollar, every server contract and client agreement and subsidiary entity, down to the last clause. Calvin nodded slowly. He already knew the numbers. What he needed from Patricia was the legal confirmation, the formal articulation of what his situation actually was, stated plainly by someone whose job was precision. Then Patricia set her pen down. She told him there was something else. Her office had received a courtesy notification the previous Thursday, the day before the dinner, from a firm called Whitmore & Associates, a boutique family law practice in the city. The notification was a routine professional inquiry, the kind that attorneys send when a client begins exploring divorce proceedings, and counsel wants to know whether an opposing party has existing legal representation. The inquiry had been addressed to Okafor and Reeves. It referenced Calvin Darius Merritt by name. Simone had visited a divorce attorney before the dinner. Calvin sat with that for a moment. Not with anger, with the specific, clarifying recognition of a man who has just had his last remaining uncertainty resolved. She had already been planning to leave. The dinner had not been an explosion of cruelty. It had been a closing statement from a woman who believed she was already holding the stronger hand. She had been wrong about that. Calvin looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked back at Patricia and told her what he wanted. He used 3 sentences. He said he wanted the divorce filed on his terms and his timeline. He said he wanted the compliance file activated through proper regulatory channels. He said he wanted Simone to understand, when it was over, exactly what she had poured wine on. Patricia looked at him for a beat. Then she reached for a fresh legal pad, uncapped her pen, and wrote one word at the top of the first page: Viridian. The plan did not begin with anger. It began with paperwork. Patricia cleared her schedule for the rest of that week. That was the first signal Calvin had that she understood the scope of what they were doing. In 11 years of working together, she had never once cleared her schedule for anything. She managed her time the way she managed legal arguments. Precisely, without waste, nothing allocated that wasn't necessary. When she told her assistant to move 3 client meetings and block the conference room through Friday, Calvin understood that she had looked at the full picture and decided it required her complete attention. She was right. They spent Tuesday and Wednesday morning mapping the 3 tracks. Patricia laid them out on a whiteboard in her conference room with the clean efficiency of a surgeon marking incision lines. Track 1 was the compliance audit, the regulatory filing that would surface Meridian's data certification gap and Simone's signature on the defective document. Track 2 was the contract renegotiation, Viridian Logic formally revisiting the terms of its infrastructure agreement with Meridian, triggering a mandatory audit clause buried in Section 9 of the original service contract that Meridian's legal team had signed without fully reading. Track 3 was the divorce. Each track would move independently. Each track would produce its own damage. Together, they would be devastating. The compliance audit moved first. Patricia's office prepared the filing through a subsidiary of Viridian Logic, a shell entity called Stonegate Infrastructure Partners that held several of C. Merritt's vendor contracts and had no visible connection to Calvin Merritt by name. The filing went to the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections on Wednesday afternoon, routed through Stonegate's registered counsel in a different city. It documented the data certification discrepancy in precise technical language, attached 22 months of internal flagging records, and named Meridian Financial Group's compliance department as the responsible party. It named the signing officer on the defective certification. It named Simone Elaine Merritt. The renegotiation notice went out Thursday morning. It was a single-page, formal, cold, contractual, issued on Viridian Logic letterhead under the service agreement's renegotiation clause. No explanation was offered beyond what the contract required. Meridian's general counsel would receive it, read it, and spend the rest of the day trying to figure out why a vendor that had never caused a moment of trouble was suddenly requesting a full contract review and mandatory compliance audit. They would find no obvious answer. That was intentional. Calvin opened the compliance folder on his own system that same Thursday morning and pulled the records on Quinton's 2 buried transactions. He had reviewed them before, back in Year 7 when his team had first flagged the irregularity, but he went through them again now with fresh eyes and a different purpose. The transactions were clean in their concealment. Quinton had routed them through a legitimate processing pathway and adjusted the timestamps on the disclosure triggers to fall outside the reporting window. It was the kind of move that required just enough sophistication to avoid a casual audit and just enough arrogance to assume no one would ever look carefully. Calvin printed the documentation, signed the chain of custody form his general counsel had prepared, and sent the package to Patricia's office by secure courier. Patricia called him at 2:15 to confirm receipt. She said simply, "Hartwell and Briggs will be named in the discovery scope." Then she moved on to the next item. The divorce filing was prepared by Friday. Patricia held it. The timing of its delivery, she explained, was the one element that required precision above all others. It needed to arrive after the compliance storm had already started moving, so that when Simone received it, she would already be underwater and unable to think clearly. A drowning person makes worse decisions than a standing one. Patricia knew this. She had spent 30 years watching people make decisions under pressure, and she had learned to use that pressure the way a craftsman uses a vice. Calvin reviewed the draft of the divorce filing on Friday evening in the back office. He read it the way he read contract, methodically, without emotion, checking each clause against what he knew to be true. Patricia had structured the asset disclosure to make the C. Merritt premarital protection airtight. The joint marital estate, the house, 2 shared accounts, a vehicle, was itemized cleanly. Simone would receive her legal share of those assets and nothing more. The number was $340,000, which was a precise and complete accounting of what 9 years of marriage had legally entitled her to. On Saturday, Calvin called Deacon Raymond Fields. He did not explain why he was calling. He did not mention Simone or the dinner or any of what was in motion. He called because Raymond was the kind of man whose voice had a particular steadying quality. He had the voice of someone who had seen enough of life's machinery to know that it turned whether you worried about it or not. They talked for 22 minutes about nothing consequential. Raymond asked how Calvin's mother was doing. Calvin said she was well. Raymond said he had noticed Calvin looking tired lately, and that the Lord's rest was not just for Sundays. Calvin said he knew. When he hung up, he felt something release in his chest that he had not realized was tight. He went back to his desk. He answered his emails. He drove to the grocery store in the same modest car he had driven for 4 years, and bought a pot roast and a bag of coffee, and came home and cooked dinner for one in a house that was almost finished, being his problem. On Thursday of the following week at 4:47 in the afternoon, the first documents left Okafor and Reeves by certified mail and secure electronic filing simultaneously. Not a single person at Meridian Financial Group knew who had sent them. In Simone's world, the storm had no name yet, but the wind had already changed. The SEC notification arrived at Meridian Financial Group on a Monday morning. It came through the firm's registered compliance inbox at 7:52, before most of the staff had finished their first cup of coffee. By 8:15, the head of Meridian's internal compliance team had read it twice and forwarded it to the general counsel with a single line of text that read, "We have a problem." By 8:30, the general counsel had read the filing and picked up the phone. By 9 o'clock, 3 senior partners were in a conference room with the door closed and their voices low. The filing was precise, surgical. It documented a data certification discrepancy spanning 22 months of Meridian's infrastructure reporting. It named the signing officer on the defective certification. It attached the original documents with the signature clearly visible at the bottom of each page. Simone Elaine Merritt, Regional Vice President, Compliance Certification Officer. Her name, her title, her signature. The HR meeting was called by 11 that same morning. Simone walked into it believing it was a briefing. She walked out of it with her promotion suspended, her access to the regional VP systems revoked, and a formal notice of pending investigation placed in her personnel file. She was told to continue reporting to work while the review was underway. She was told this with the careful, lawyered language of an institution protecting itself from every direction simultaneously. She drove home that Tuesday in a daze that felt like the road was moving under her instead of beneath her tires. She pulled into the parking garage the following morning out of habit. Not thinking, just driving the route her body knew. And when she reached the security turnstile and pressed her badge to the reader, the light stayed red. She pressed it again. Red. A security officer materialized with the practiced blankness of a man who had done this before and would do it again. He said her access had been deactivated pending the investigation. He said she could contact HR for further information. He said it without meeting her eyes. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she drove home. She called Calvin from the driveway. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly the same as it always was, measured, unhurried, present in the particular way of a man who has nowhere else to be. She told him about the badge. She told him about the HR meeting. She waited for something from him. Alarm, questions, any signal that they were in this together. He said he was sorry to hear that. He asked if she had eaten anything. She hung up. Hartwell and Briggs moved on Wednesday. The discovery scope from the SEC filing had reached Quinton's firm through the regulatory net that connected Hartwell and Briggs to Meridian's derivative processing chain. The compliance team at Hartwell and Briggs had pulled the flagged transactions within 48 hours of receiving the inquiry. They found both of them: the timestamp irregularities, the routing adjustments, the buried disclosure triggers. It took their legal team 4 hours to determine that Quinton had acted alone and that the firm's exposure could be limited if they moved immediately. They terminated him the same day, by phone, at 2:17 in the afternoon. Quinton called Simone 11 minutes later. His voice was nothing like his voice. The performance was gone, the crowd working, the name dropping, the particular brand of loud confidence he had worn like a second skin since childhood. What was left sounded like a man standing in a room that had just lost all its walls. He said they fired him. He said they were talking about bar review. He said he needed her to do something, call someone, use one of her connections. He said he didn't understand what was happening. Simone had no answers. She was running out of connections to use. Financial Compliance Weekly published the story on Thursday morning. The headline was 12 words, and they were devastating. Simone read it on her laptop at the kitchen table while her coffee went cold. She read her own name in the 4th sentence, and then read the paragraph again to confirm she had read it correctly. She had. Her name was in a compliance publication, read by every serious professional in her industry, attached to a story about a certification failure that had triggered a federal regulatory review. The group chat went silent by noon. 3 partners removed her from the co-authored industry panel by Thursday evening. She saw the notification in her email: a clean administrative removal, no explanation offered. Gerald Ashford did not return her call that day, or the next. His assistant said he was unavailable. His assistant said it the same way every time, without variation, like a door that had been closed and bolted from the inside. Calvin noted all of this from a distance. He received Patricia's updates by secure message each evening. He read them the way he read performance reports. Methodically, without drama, noting what had changed and what had not yet moved. He did not feel satisfaction exactly. What he felt was the specific recognition of a man watching a structure fail along the precise fault lines he had identified years earlier. He knew where every crack was because he had been the one holding the building together. The divorce filing arrived at the house on Friday morning at 9 o'clock exactly. A process server in a grey jacket knocked twice and handed the envelope to whoever answered the door. Simone answered. She stood in the doorway and read the first page. Then she walked to the kitchen. She did not make it to a chair. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, and the papers in her lap, and the compliance headline still open on her laptop on the table above her. Quinton was unemployed. Her badge was deactivated. Her name was in print. And Calvin, quiet, steady, invisible Calvin, had just filed for divorce with an attorney she had never heard of, representing a company she had not known existed. She had one move left. She needed to get in a room with him and explain herself. Simone knocked on the back office door at 9:17 on Saturday morning. She had texted him the night before, a single sentence, measured, stripped of the performance that usually lived in everything she sent. She said she needed to speak with him. He had replied within 2 minutes. One word, he said office. She stood in the hallway for a moment before she knocked. She had walked past this door 10,000 times in 9 years. She had never been invited through it. She did not know, standing there, that the invitation itself was the last thing he would ever give her. Calvin opened the door and stepped aside. She walked in and stopped. The room was nothing like she had imagined it, and she understood in that instant that she had never seriously imagined it at all, which was its own kind of confession. 2 large monitors faced each other across a standing desk. Legal binders lined a shelf along the left wall, labelled by year, running all the way back to 2015. A whiteboard on the right wall had diagrams on it that she could not read but recognized instinctively as architecture. Systems maps, dependency chains, the visual language of something large and deliberately constructed. And on the shelf directly above his desk, framed simply in dark wood, was the executed signature page from the Ether contract. The FedEx envelope it had arrived in sat beside the frame, preserved exactly as it had been the night of the dinner. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she sat in the chair across from his desk and she began with the explanation. She told him the dinner was not what it looked like. She said she had been under enormous professional pressure. She said the wine was a mistake, born of a bad moment, and that she had not intended it the way it appeared. She spoke carefully, constructing each sentence the way she constructed presentations, with structure, with forward momentum, with conclusions already built into the premises. Calvin sat behind his desk and listened with his hands folded on the surface in front of him. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He let her finish completely, and then she moved to the negotiation. She said they could work this out. She said the divorce filing did not have to proceed. She said she understood now. She used the word now with a weight that suggested she meant it, that she had underestimated him, and that things could be different going forward. She talked about what they had built together, meaning the house and the life and the social structure of their 9 years. She did not mention Viridian Logic. She could not bring herself to name it directly, as if naming it would finalize something she was still trying to hold open. Calvin let her finish that too. Then the apology came. It was the most genuine of the 3 attempts and the most desperate. Her voice changed register, lost some of its architecture, became something raw and less managed. She said she was sorry for the wine. She said she was sorry for the years of dismissal. She said she had been wrong about what he was, and she knew it now, and she was asking him to consider what that acknowledgement cost her to make. He considered it. Then he spoke. He said, "Simone, I am going to tell you some things, and I need you to let me finish all the way through." She went still. He told her about the 9 years first, not with anger, with the quiet, factual delivery of a man who had organized his thoughts long before this moment arrived. He told her about the 3 Meridian events and the conversation with Wallace and the way she had answered the question about his work by steering around it. He told her about the 4th of July when Quinton said the thing he said and nobody at the table corrected him. He told her about the Sunday mornings when he drove to church alone for 9 years running and what that drive felt like at the end of year 8 when he understood with complete clarity that invisibility was not something being done to him. It was something she had decided he deserved. He paused. Then he told her about slide 14. He watched her face move through 3 separate expressions as he explained what Viridian Logic was, what it had built, and where Meridian's back-end infrastructure lived. He watched the sequence complete itself, confusion, then recognition, then something that had no precise name but lived in the body like a physical impact. He told her that the case study she had presented to Meridian's board, the one she had called a benchmark of operational excellence, had been built in the office she was sitting in. He told her that Gerald Ashford had been trying to meet the man behind it for 2 full years, and that man had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at her family's table and been referred to as her house husband by her brother while the turkey was still warm. Simone made a sound that was not a word. Calvin continued. He said, "You poured wine on me in front of every person whose opinion you have spent 9 years performing for. But what you did not know was that the platform your firm called a model of excellence in the case study you put on slide 14 of your own pitch deck was built in the office you told me to be ashamed of. Gerald has been trying to meet me for 2 years. He had dinner with me every Thanksgiving." The room was completely silent. Simone broke then, not with dignity, not with composure, not in any of the ways that performance allows for. She broke the way structures break when the load-bearing element is finally removed. Her shoulders dropped first, then her voice, when it came, was unrecognizable to both of them. Calvin stood. He told her the divorce would proceed. He told her Patricia's office had confirmed that Sea Merit Holdings was entirely beyond the marital estate, and that her attorney had already been informed of this. He told her there was one final thing she should know. His compliance team had flagged Meridian's certification gap 22 months ago, and he had routed a private notification to Meridian's internal systems, giving them the opportunity to correct it quietly. They had not acted on it. That inaction was not his responsibility. He walked to the door and opened it. Simone stood slowly, like someone learning how their legs worked again. She walked through the doorway and down the hallway, past the kitchen, past the dining room where 30 people had watched her pour wine on a man she had never understood, and out the front door of a house she had never truly known. Calvin closed the office door. He sat back down at his desk. He picked up his pen. What happens next takes 12 months, and it cost Simone everything she ever performed for. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in March, 12 months after the dinner. Calvin sat in a wood-paneled courthouse room with Patricia on one side and a window on the other, and he watched the process complete itself with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, present, unhurried, fully there. Simone sat across the table with her attorney, a man from Whitmore and Associates, who had the look of someone who had reviewed the Sea Merit holding structure 3 times and arrived at the same unwelcome conclusion each time. There was no argument left to make. The pre-marital incorporation was airtight. The asset separation was clean. Simone received her legal share of the jointly titled marital home, $340,000 precisely accounted for, not 1 cent more. Sea Merit Holdings was untouched. Viridian Logic was untouched. The $42 billion Aether contract was untouched. Everything Calvin had built in the back office belonged entirely and exclusively to Calvin. Simone did not look at him when she signed. He did not require her to. Quinton's bar review concluded 6 weeks later. The findings were not in his favor. The 2 buried transactions, the timestamp adjustments, the routing manipulations, the deliberate circumvention of the disclosure triggers, were documented in language precise enough to constitute a formal record of professional misconduct. His license was suspended for 2 years. Hartwell and Briggs filed its civil suit the same week the bar decision was published, seeking recovery of losses attributable to the compliance failures Quinton's actions had contributed to. He retained a lawyer with money he did not have. The case would take years to resolve. The outcome was not uncertain. The man who had laughed first at that dinner table would have a long time to think about what he had found so funny. Simone's career at Meridian did not survive the regulatory review. The investigation concluded with a formal censure attached to her professional record and a determination that her certification sign-off had constituted a material compliance failure regardless of intent. Meridian did not terminate her. They offered her a path out that looked from the outside like a transition. She accepted a compliance consultant position at a regional advisory firm whose name did not appear in any publication that mattered. She showed up on Monday mornings to a building that was not on the 43rd floor. She did her work. The 30 people who had attended her celebration dinner had, by that point, quietly reorganized their professional proximity away from her. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just in the way that ambitious people reorganize their proximity when someone's orbit shifts and the gravitational pull changes. Gerald Ashford never did get his introduction. Calvin relocated in April. He found a townhouse 4 blocks from Greater Bethel AME in the same neighborhood he had lived in for 9 years. Same grocery store, same dry cleaner, same drive to the church parking lot on Sunday mornings. The townhouse had a back room he set up as an office within the first week. Same desk, same lamp. He hung the framed ether signature page on the wall above the monitor, where the light from the window hit it in the late afternoon. Viridian Logic was named to the Forbes private company list that spring. A researcher from the magazine called Patricia's office requesting an interview with the founder. Patricia relayed the request. Calvin declined without elaboration. Viridian Logic continued operating with 47 engineers distributed across 6 time zones, processing infrastructure for clients who did not know and did not need to know anything about the quiet man who had built their systems from a spare room with $22,000 and 9 years of uninterrupted discipline. In June, C. Merritt Holdings established the Merritt Raines Foundation. The endowment was $4 million, funded directly from a C. Merritt operating account. The foundation's stated purpose was the support of computer science education at historically black colleges and universities, scholarships, equipment grants, summer research fellowships. Calvin named it after his grandmother on his mother's side, a woman named Ida Raines who had worked as a seamstress for 40 years and kept a ledger of every dollar she had ever saved in a composition notebook under her bed. He thought she would have found the whole story deeply satisfying and not particularly surprising. He did not announce the foundation publicly. Patricia filed the required documentation. The first scholarships went out in September. On the 3rd Sunday of October, Deacon Raymond Fields found Calvin after service in the vestibule, where the congregation gathered with their good coats still on and the smell of someone's sweet potato pie drifting in from the fellowship hall. Raymond put a hand on Calvin's shoulder, the particular warm gravity of a hand that has steadied many people through many things. And he said, simply, that there was someone he wanted him to meet. Her name was Diane. She was a structural engineer. She had been attending Greater Bethel for 2 years, and she had been seated 3 rows behind Calvin for most of them. Raymond said nothing more. He did not need to. Diane laughed at something Calvin said within the first 4 minutes, and it was the kind of laugh that has no performance in it. Unguarded, genuine, the sound of a person who finds things actually funny rather than strategically amusing. Calvin laughed too. It was the first time in a very long time that a room felt like somewhere he was supposed to be. He drove home in the same modest car he had driven for 4 years. He made coffee. He sat down at his desk in the back room with the late afternoon light coming through the window and the framed signature page on the wall and the quiet that he had always understood was not emptiness. It was space. Space for the work. Space for the discipline. Space for the life that invisibility had been protecting all along. Here is what this story asks us to remember. The loudest person in any room is rarely the most powerful one. Power does not announce itself. It does not perform for an audience, does not need to be seen to be real. Calvin Merritt spent 9 years being dismissed by people who confused his silence for limitation, and when the moment came, his silence was the most devastating thing in the room. He did not pour wine on anyone. He did not need to. Now, I want to ask you something before you go. If you were in Calvin's position, 9 years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated like you had nothing to offer, what would you have done? Would you have revealed your hand sooner? Would you have walked away earlier? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Wait, build, and let the truth land when it was ready. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it before the next video drops, because what is coming next is going to be even bigger than this. The back office light is still on.